This week on Jerusalem Dateline.
ISIS must be defeated. But to defeat ISIS and leave Iran as a threshold nuclear power is to win the battle and lose the war.
As the world turns its attention to ISIS, Israel's prime minister eyes a bigger threat. Plus, we'll unravel the mystery of the 4 blood moons, find out exactly what they are and what they mean. And the Palestinian Authority claims to stand for the oppressed. So why are they getting rich? Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. While the military might of the world is focused on ISIS, some in the Middle East worry that an even greater danger is progressing unchecked: the threat of a nuclear Iran. For the first time in years, much of the world and many Arab countries appear unified, this time against ISIS terrorists. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, however, continues to sound the alarm over the danger of a nuclear Iran.
ISIS must be defeated. But to defeat ISIS and leave Iran as a threshold nuclear power is to win the battle and lose the war.
Netanyahu and other Israeli officials warn that Iran's nuclear program is what keeps them up at night. One official said that ISIS is a 5-year problem, but Iran is a 50-year problem.
And I am here to tell you that Israel is deeply concerned.
That concern, according to Intelligence Minister Yuval Steinitz, is about negotiations over Iran's nuclear program.
The Iranians have shown no real flexibility on the 2 main issues. The issue of the centrifuge facilities, centrifuges for enrichment of uranium, and the heavy water reactor in Iraq.
Steinitz also said Israel worries negotiators will end up with a bad deal. He maintains no deal is better than a bad deal.
No deal means that you stand by your principle, that you are not giving up, that you are not sacrificing the future of the world, that you are not sacrificing global security, that you are not ready that what happened with North Korea will repeat itself after 1 or 2 or 3 years with Iran.
And Middle East analyst Jonathan Spire comes back to the fight against ISIS and how it could ironically help Iran.
So if it becomes the paramount or the sole goal of Western policy to destroy Sunni Islamism and Sunni jihadis in these areas, the effective result of that will be, by default, so to speak, to strengthen the enemies of those forces, which are not democratic forces, they're pro-Iranian forces. The Shia Islamists align with Iran. So it's crucial to keep that bigger picture in mind, I think, if we are to avoid effectively strengthening, or even absurdly, acting in cooperation with our most dangerous enemies in the region.
Have you ever heard of a blood moon? The appearance of a single red moon is not unusual, but 4 of them appearing closely together is extremely rare. And that's what we're seeing this year and next. A recent book said these mysterious signs in the sky are an indication that something big is about to happen in Israel. Eric Steckelbeck sat down with author John Hagee about what this means for the Middle East and beyond.
The book of Genesis says God uses the sun, moon, and stars for signs and seasons. Examples can be found throughout the Bible. Think of how a star led the wise men to Jesus, or the sun stood still as Joshua led Israel to victory over its enemies. According to Pastor John Hagee, God is getting ready to speak this way once again.
There's a sense in the world that things are changing, and God is trying to communicate with us in a supernatural way. I believe that in these next 2 years, we're going to see something dramatic happen in the Middle East involving Israel that will change the course of history in the Middle East and impact the whole world.
In his latest book, 4 Blood Moons, Hagee lays out what he calls celestial signals. He describes how a series of blood moons in 2014 and 2015 will have great significance for Israel. Although single blood moons are a fairly regular occurrence, 4 of them appearing so closely together is extremely rare.
We've only seen a series of blood moons a handful of times over the past 500 years. So what exactly is a blood moon, and what is the biblical significance of it?
A blood moon is when the earth comes between the sun and the moon, and the sun is shining through the atmosphere of the earth and cast upon the moon a red shadow. and so the moon appears to be red.
Such moons appear in Scripture. In the book of Joel, God says there will be wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. In Acts, the Apostle Peter repeats that verse from Joel. And the book of Revelation says that during the Great Tribulation, the moon will become like blood. Blood moons appear in April 2014 on Passover and then again in September 2014 during the Feast of Tabernacles or Sukkot. It's the same timing for 2015 for a total of 4 blood moons all appearing on Jewish feast days.
The sun and the moon and the earth are controlled by God Almighty. He is the one that's getting them in a direct alignment on a certain day at a certain time, but each time it's a Passover or Sukkot.
In the past, the rare appearance of 4 blood moons on these feast days has coincided with major events for Israel and the Jewish people. 1492, Spain expelled the Jews. Columbus also discovered America, which became a safe haven for the Jewish people.
In each of these blood moons, you have something that begins with a tragedy and ends in triumph.
1948, Israel is reborn as a nation.
After 2,000 years, God supernaturally brought them from 66 nations, and a nation was born in a day. That, again, was a supernatural something that happened following the tragedy of the Holocaust.
1967, Israel wins the Six-Day War and recaptures Jerusalem.
For the first time in 2,000 years, Jerusalem and the state of Israel were together again.
The blood moons of 2014 and 2015 appear as Iran works towards nuclear weapons and Israel's neighbors, Egypt and Syria, are in chaos.
The end game is coming with this Iranian nuclear crisis.
The only reason Iran will not develop a nuclear bomb will be that Israel chooses a military solution to that crisis. I believe if that happens, that will start a series of events that will change the course of world history. If Israel does not, it will still change the course of world history.
Hagee warns of the Iranian nuclear threat through his work with Christians United for Israel, which he founded in 2006. It is now the largest pro-Israel organization in America, with some 1.3 million members. He also holds nights to honor Israel across the country and at San Antonio's Cornerstone Church, where he serves as senior pastor. The first event in 1981 drew bomb threats and vandalism from anti-Semites. Yet Hagee continues his mission.
If there was ever a time for the Christians of America to stiffen their spine and stand up and speak up, it's now. To see evil and not call it evil is evil.
He says it's still unclear what the coming blood moons will bring, but he is certain of one thing.
When all is said and done, Israel is going to prevail. The flag of Israel will be flying over the walls of the city of Jerusalem when Messiah comes, and it's going to be forever. And every nation that rises up in judgment against Israel, God will punish and punish severely.
Eric Stakelbeck, CBN News, San Antonio, Texas.
Up next, Palestinians oppressing their own people, and your taxes are paying for it. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is pressing the international community to create a Palestinian state in the biblical land of Israel. While some see him as the best partner for peace, Palestinian insiders say his regime is riddled with corruption, paid for by Western tax dollars. Mahmoud Abbas has led the fight for Palestinians since the 2004 death of Chairman Yasser Arafat. In addition to leaving a leadership opening, Arafat left behind secret bank accounts filled with $1 billion or more in public funds and international aid taken from his own people. As Abbas, also known as Abu Mazen, took over, Palestinians hoped for change.
When Abu Mazen came to power, he spoke about reforming the security services and the judiciary. It means that he recognized that there is corruption.
Ahmed lives in a West Bank city under Palestinian Authority control, with hidden his identity to protect his life.
What happened was that they created ways to cover up corruption when complaints were made.
About 2 million people live here in the West Bank, biblical Judea and Samaria, under Palestinian Authority rule. And while the world blames Israel for oppressing Palestinians, some say the Palestinians themselves are most often the oppressors.
Most of the Palestinians know about the corruption, but the normal citizens are afraid because there is terror against them, and they know that they cannot do anything, and they and their families and children could be subjected to dangers and sexual abuse.
Ahmed said authorities lie about people, saying they're dealing drugs, collaborating with Israel, or acting immorally if they have a personal vendetta against someone.
I know another case when somebody asked a man from Fatah to give him his pay, but he refused. After that, a group came after midnight, entered his home, and killed him, and they abused his family and threw him from the window, and beat his children very badly. When people intervened, they issued a statement saying this man was an agent of Israel.
Human rights attorney Caleb Maya says he's concerned both about Israel and also for Palestinians living under Abbas.
If somebody in the Palestinian Authority was to stand in the public square and criticize Mahmoud Abbas, they'll be arrested, many times tortured, and sometimes they just disappear. There's a huge fear factor.
And to make things worse, this corruption and oppression is financially supported by taxpayers in the West. According to a 2014 congressional report, the U.S. government has committed more than $5 billion to the Palestinians since the mid-1990s.
More than 25 times per capita money has been given from the international community to the Palestinian Authority than all the money given from the United States to Europe after World War II under the Marshall Plan for the complete reconstruction of the European economy. Yet, the average Palestinian is still living in abject poverty.
In 2013, a European Union court audit showed that there had been significant shortcomings in the way more than $3 billion in European aid had been handled. In this clip, courtesy of Palestinian Media Watch, Abbas indicates where the money may have gone since 2007. PMW says that's $47 million a month. Meyer says Palestinians are always pleading for more.
We need this money in order to do things, to create industry, to build roads, to create jobs. Well, why is that not happening? And so it's not just where the money is going, but it's where it's not going to that I think the West needs to get on top of.
While Abbas is blasting Israel and pushing hard for recognition of an independent state, some are saying it would only be a disaster. Coming up, a Middle East expert analyzes the growing threat of ISIS and radical Islam. Last week, we ran an interview with Ryan Morrow of the Clarion Project. Here's our second installment about his views on the growing threat of ISIS and radical Islam.
The most powerful recruitment tool of ISIS is the fact that they can argue that they were successful. One of the most important lessons in understanding the jihadist ideology, particularly when they argue with each other, is if they say, okay, we have a disagreement, well, who is succeeding? Because that's who Allah is blessing. If an unpopular jihadist group starts grabbing territory, as ISIS did, 1/3 of Syria, 1/3 of Iraq, all of a sudden those that previously doubted that group say, well, obviously Allah must be blessing them. And that is why we can never allow a group like ISIS to have what appears to be momentum or to be victorious, because that sends the message throughout the Muslim world that they are accurately implementing God's will. And then that's what draws recruits to them. So it's very important that whenever they seize territory that we take action for them to lose it. As for the issue of foreign fighters, we know that an estimate 12 to 15,000 foreign fighters have joined ISIS. In terms of the Americans, the estimates are somewhere between 100 and 300 have gone over to Syria to either join ISIS or another jihadist group. So that's obviously a very big threat. There was a Democratic congressman that said that 40 Americans that were linked with ISIS overseas have already come back to the United States. But what I'm most concerned about is the lesson that the Muslim world is learning from ISIS's success. Are they learning that this is the way you take on the West and that this is what Allah wants, and American weakness magnifies that perception that ISIS is the right way forward?
President Obama, when he spoke to the nation about ISIS, he said that it wasn't Islamic, or the Islamic State wasn't Islamic, and at the UN he called Islam a religion of peace. Do you think that he's muddying the waters and making it confusing for people about what is really real Islam?
Yes, definitely. I think that the problem with President Obama declaring the Islamic State not to be Islamic or a state is that it removes the responsibility away from the Muslim world in explaining why this is happening. If we acknowledge the truth, that this is at least an interpretation of Islam, you don't have to say it's the right interpretation, but you have to acknowledge that it is an interpretation of Islam. They are quoting the Quran, they are quoting Islamic scripture, it's an interpretation of Islam. When that's acknowledged, then Muslims have to explain and say, oh, well, this is why we disagree with that. That theological battle has to take place, but the starting point for that dialogue to take place is acknowledging that the problem here is an interpretation of Islam. It's the combination of mosque and state and turning Islam into a political doctrine. A great example of this is the fact that there's all this positive press right now about Muslim leaders around the world, including many here in the United States, that wrote a letter with a rebuttal to ISIS, a theological rebuttal. And I read it, and much of it sounded great, but then I came across a few different passages that really bothered me. Yes, they condemned the tactics of ISIS, but they endorsed resurrecting the caliphate, which requires the destruction of Israel. And most amazingly, they endorsed Sharia law, specifically including the punishments in relations to criminal justice. The most horrific parts of Sharia law were endorsed by the Muslims that the United States government and the media is praising for condemning ISIS. So does that really make them moderate? I don't think so.
What's their final goal?
Well, the same goal of all jihadists, whether they are nonviolent or violent, whether they agree with the tactics of Al-Qaeda and ISIS or not, is always implementing Sharia over the entire globe. In the short term, it's implementing it in the Muslim lands. Then it's creating a caliphate, then it's destroying Israel. But the end goal always is Sharia over the entire globe. And one of the interesting developments I've seen particularly with ISIS and other jihadists, is how much they're wrapping themselves in end times theology. Whenever a jihadist talks about, oh, we're going to break the cross, or America, we condemn you for being the protector of the cross, what they are referencing is an end times Islamic prophecy where they believe Jesus comes back, helps their Islamic Messiah defeat Christianity and the Jews and the rest of the world, and they believe that Jesus comes, helps the jihadis defeat Christianity, and then bans Christianity. So there's much more to it whenever you hear a jihadist saying, oh, we're going to break the cross. That's not just a threat to the United States and to Christianity. They are saying that they are creating the conditions for their version of Jesus to show up and help them conquer the world.
Is the United States the main impediment to establishing Sharia law all over the world?
Yes, and Israel, and also Europe. But the reason that Israel receives so much hatred from the jihadists is because they stand right in the way of the short-term goals they need to achieve in order to accomplish that long-term goal of attacking the United States. And so the reason that Israel gets all the attention is because they are the first stumbling block for the jihadist agenda. After that, it's Europe and the United States. They condemn all of us, but right now they really need to focus on the countries in the region and primarily Israel.
Appreciate you being here with on Jerusalem Dateline.
All right, thank you so much.
Coming up, American evangelicals unite on Capitol Hill to support Israel. Former presidential candidate Mike Huckabee says Israel's enemies also have America in their sights.
Israel isn't the ultimate target, we are.
American evangelicals are showing their support for Israel. Recently, former presidential candidate Mike Huckabee and the group Concerned Women for America joined forces on Capitol Hill to sponsor the Stand With Israel rally. Paul Strand brings us that story.
The president of Concerned Women for America explained this rally was birthed when she was in Israel and realized why it's important to support Israel today as it faces enemies who want to wipe it out. She asked herself then if she would have supported Jews during World War II when they also faced the threat of extinction.
If I had been alive during the Holocaust, what would I have done? Would I have been one of those people, one of those Christians who just turned away and turned a blind eye to the evil that was right before me?
Showing support for Israel isn't just taking an altruistic stand, because those here were quick to point out that the enemies who would destroy Israel first are completely ready and dedicated to turning around and destroying America next.
Former Republican presidential candidate Mike Huckabee said he believes God will save Israel from destruction. But ISIS, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran still want to destroy it, and he warns they wouldn't stop there.
You honestly think that if they were to achieve that they would say, well, that's it, we're done? Israel isn't the ultimate target, we are.
CBN's terrorism analyst Eric Stakelbeck agreed, pointing out that Iran will have intercontinental ballistic missiles by 2015, and it could use those missiles to target America.
Israel is the little Satan, a bump on the road to the great Satan. Us, their words, not mine.
Concerned Women for America wanted to show there are also many young concerned women for Israel. Among them, Raquel Minka, a young Baltimore Jew who, when she heard there'd be an anti-Israel protest in her neighborhood, threw together a counter-rally with hundreds more participants. To her, this is personal.
My grandparents are Holocaust survivors. They fought the fight. My dad is a wounded IDF veteran. He fought the fight. And now I'm doing the same.
Leading conservative writer Bill Kristol says America has to take a stand in the Middle East and fight.
We know what a world without an Israel and with an America that's weak and withdrawn looks like. And that's the world of 1939 or so, 75 years ago. And that's a world that leads to a world war, and that's a war that leads to a Holocaust.
Paul Strand, CBN News, Capitol Hill.
Finally, this week in Jerusalem Dateline, this month, hundreds gathered here in Jerusalem and millions around the world to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. The 13th annual Day of Prayer for the Peace of Jerusalem brought both Jews and Christians together to pray in what has grown into a worldwide event. God TV broadcast the prayer meeting to 190 nations.
We're here today because Jerusalem is really a city like no other. And people often don't understand that what happens in and around this city impacts the nations of the world. Everyone who is concerned with the future of our planet needs to be concerned with what happens in Jerusalem and with praying for the peace of Jerusalem, which is the key to peace for all the nations.
Thousands of churches around the world also participated in the prayer meeting that encourages people to follow the command in Psalm 122:6. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they that love you prosper. We'd like to encourage you to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Well, that's it for this edition. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.